He was my husband's best friend. The one who promised to look after me. He helped with the funeral, sorted the paperwork, even changed my locks for safety. I trusted him with everything. Until the comforting texts turned into demands. Until helping meant controlling who I saw. Until I found the hidden camera inside the smoke detector he installed, pointed straight at my bed. That's not grief. That's a hunting ground. And he didn't just change my locks, he kept the master key. How deep does the trap go when the predator built it inside your grief? Hey, story lover. Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go. The perfect storm of vulnerability. When tragedy strikes, we're told to lean on those closest to us. We're advised to accept help, to not isolate ourselves, to trust in the kindness of others during our darkest hours. But what happens when that very vulnerability becomes a weapon against us? What happens when grief becomes a hunting ground and the person offering comfort is actually positioning themselves as a predator? My name is Jordan, and this is the story of how my husband's death became another man's opportunity and how kindness became the perfect mask for something far more sinister. A friendship built on deception. David and my husband Mark had worked together for 12 years. They shared the same department, the same lunch breaks, the same complaints about management. When Mark would come home, David's name peppered nearly every work story. Weekend barbecues, company parties, late-night project deadlines, David was woven into the fabric of our lives in a way that felt natural, normal, safe. Looking back now, I realize the signs were always there. The way David's eyes would linger on me during those barbecues. How he remembered details about my life that Mark hadn't even retained. The gifts that were always slightly too personal for a work friend. A book by my favorite author that I'd mentioned once in passing. A bottle of wine from a vineyard I'd posted about on social media months earlier. At the time, I attributed it to David being thoughtful, maybe even having a better memory than my husband. Mark used to joke that David paid more attention to what I said than he did. We'd all laugh about it. The perfect cover for what was actually systematic surveillance disguised as friendship. When opportunity meets obsession. Mark's death came suddenly. A heart attack at 42, no warning signs, no time for goodbyes. One moment he was complaining about his morning coffee being too weak. The next moment paramedics were working frantically in our living room while I stood frozen in our hallway, still holding the lunch I'd packed for him. The funeral arrangements were a blur of decisions I wasn't equipped to make while drowning in shock and grief. That's when David stepped in. Not just as a pallbearer or someone offering condolences, he became my project manager for death, handling details with an efficiency that should have felt helpful but instead felt prepared. "Let me handle the obituary," he offered, already pulling out his laptop. I know all his work connections. The insurance paperwork is complicated. I dealt with something similar when my uncle passed. Let me walk you through it. You shouldn't be driving right now. I'll take care of the arrangements with the funeral home. Each offer came with a logical explanation, a reasonable justification for why he was the right person to handle these intimate details of Mark's death and my life. I was too shattered to question the eagerness, too grateful for the help to notice how quickly he'd assumed control of nearly every aspect of my immediate future. How help became control. The first week after the funeral, David's presence felt like a lifeline. He brought groceries when I couldn't face leaving the house. He handled the stream of casseroles from well-meaning neighbors. He fielded phone calls from Mark's extended family, saving me from having to repeat the story of that morning over and over again. But as the second week began, the boundaries started to blur in ways that made my skin prickle with discomfort I couldn't quite name. David began arriving earlier and staying later. He had opinions about what I should eat, when I should sleep, who I should talk to. When my sister called from across the country, offering to fly in and stay with me, David was quick to discourage it. You need space to process, he told me, his hand lingering on my shoulder longer than felt appropriate. Too many people around will just overwhelm you. Mark always said you needed quiet when you were dealing with stress. The mention of Mark's name became his trump card, a way to legitimize every suggestion, every boundary crossed, every decision made on my behalf. According to David, Mark had shared intimate details about my personality, my needs, my vulnerabilities. Details that gave David a roadmap for exactly how to position himself as indispensable. When care becomes surveillance. By the third week, David had keys to my house. I'm still not entirely sure how that happened. He mentioned something about needing to let in a repairman while I was at my first grief counseling session. He'd had copies made just in case and somehow never gave them back. When I mentioned it, he looked hurt. Jordan, I'm just trying to help. Mark would want me to make sure you're safe. That phrase, Mark would want, became the justification for everything. Mark would want David to check on me daily. Mark would want David to handle my finances during this difficult time. Mark would want David to screen my phone calls to protect me from stress. The text messages started during week 4. Initially, they came at reasonable hours and contained reasonable content. How are you feeling today? Did you remember to eat lunch? Let me know if you need anything. But soon, the messages were arriving at 11 p.m., then midnight, then 2 a.m. The content shifted from general concern to specific observations. I noticed your living room light was on late last night. Are you having trouble sleeping? Your car wasn't in the driveway this afternoon. Where did you go? When I asked how he knew these details, David's explanations were always logical. He'd been driving by on his way home from work. He'd noticed while taking his evening walk. The grocery store where he'd seen me was on his regular route. Every answer was reasonable. Every answer was a lie. The smoke detector revelation. The breaking point came during week 6, when I decided to change the batteries in all the smoke detectors. It was one of those mindless tasks that grief makes you cling to, something normal, something routine, something that doesn't require emotional processing. I was standing on a ladder in my bedroom, reaching up to the detector that David had replaced with a better model the week before, when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. A tiny lens, barely visible, embedded in what should have been just a smoke detection device. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly fell off the ladder. I managed to get the device down and examined it more closely. It wasn't just a smoke detector. It was a camera positioned with a perfect view of my bed, my dresser, my most private space. I sat on my bedroom floor, holding this violation in my hands, and finally understood what had been happening. David hadn't been helping me through grief. He'd been using my grief to build himself access to every aspect of my life. The daily check-ins weren't concern, they were intelligence gathering. The financial help wasn't kindness, it was control. The late-night texts weren't worry, they were proof that he was watching, always watching. Recognizing the systematic takeover. Once I understood what I was looking at, everything else clicked into place with terrifying clarity. I started making a list, not because anyone had told me to, but because my mind needed to organize the chaos of realization. David had my keys, my financial information, my daily schedule, my social security number for the insurance paperwork, access to Mark's email accounts to handle work transitions, and now, apparently, a live feed of my most private moments. He'd positioned himself as the logical heir to Mark's role in my life, not just as a friend, but as a partner. He'd isolated me from other support systems by subtly discouraging visits from family and friends. He'd made himself indispensable by creating dependencies I hadn't even realized were forming. The gifts he'd been bringing weren't condolences, they were claiming stakes. The flowers weren't sympathy, they were courtship. The constant presence wasn't grief support, it was territorial marking. Most chilling of all, I realized this hadn't started after Mark died. Looking back at those 12 years of friendship, David had been studying us, learning our patterns, our vulnerabilities, our dynamics. He'd been positioning himself for this opportunity long before the opportunity existed. When predators drop their masks. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, holding the camera detector, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I confront David? Should I just disappear? As if summoned by my fear, David's key turned in my front door at 6:30 a.m. He walked in like he lived there, carrying coffee and bagels, talking about his plans for our day before he even noticed my expression. Jordan? What's wrong? You look. I held up the camera. The transformation in David's face was instant and terrifying. The concerned friend disappeared completely, replaced by something cold and calculating. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look surprised. You weren't supposed to find that yet, he said quietly, setting down the coffee with careful deliberation. I was going to tell you eventually. When you were ready. Ready for what? Ready to understand that Mark is gone and I'm here. Ready to accept that what we had, what we've always had, doesn't have to end just because he's not here anymore. The delusion in his voice was almost as frightening as the admission. In David's mind, there had always been a we. In his mind, Mark had been the obstacle, not the foundation of our connection. In his mind, Mark's death wasn't a tragedy, it was liberation. The depth of the deception. What came next was worse than I could have imagined. David, apparently relieved that his secret was out, began sharing details about the extent of his surveillance and manipulation with the enthusiasm of someone finally able to discuss their favorite hobby. He'd been tracking my location through a GPS device attached to my car. He'd been reading my text messages through spyware installed on my phone during one of his helpful tech support sessions. He'd been intercepting my mail and screening my calls, deciding which communications I was ready to handle. The financial paperwork he'd been helping with? He'd been redirecting portions of Mark's life insurance and retirement accounts into joint accounts that required both our signatures, accounts I'd signed documents for without reading carefully during those first foggy weeks of grief. The home security system he'd upgraded? It sent alerts to his phone, not mine. He knew every time I left the house, every time I returned, every window or door that opened. Most disturbing of all, he'd been creating a paper trail that would support his narrative. Documents that showed him as my financial power of attorney. Records of his caregiving activities. Evidence that could be interpreted as a relationship developing naturally from shared grief. I've been protecting you, he said, apparently believing his own narrative. You were so lost without him. You needed someone to take care of the details, someone who understood what Mark would have wanted for you. When escape routes are controlled. As David talked, I realized the full scope of what he'd accomplished. This wasn't just surveillance or obsession, it was a systematic takeover designed to make me completely dependent on him while making it appear consensual to any outside observer. He controlled my finances, my communications, my physical security, and my daily routine. He'd isolated me from support systems and positioned himself as my primary resource for everything from groceries to emotional support. If I tried to call for help, would anyone believe that this helpful friend who'd been taking such good care of me was actually a predator? If I went to the police, what crime could I prove? That someone had been too helpful during my time of grief? David had built the perfect trap, one disguised as kindness, justified by my vulnerability, and documented as consensual assistance. He'd used my grief as both a weapon against me and a shield for himself. Jordan, he said, moving closer, you're upset because you're scared of change. But this is natural. This is what was always supposed to happen. Mark knew it too. He used to joke about how well I knew you, how much attention I paid to what you needed. The idea that Mark had been aware of David's obsession and had somehow approved it was a violation so profound I couldn't process it. But it also revealed something crucial. David genuinely believed his own narrative. In his mind, this wasn't predation, it was destiny. Reclaiming agency in the face of manipulation. Something shifted in me during that conversation. Maybe it was rage, maybe it was survival instinct, Maybe it was just finally understanding that I was fighting for my life in a way that had nothing to do with physical violence and everything to do with psychological warfare. David, I said, standing up and facing him directly, you need to leave. Now. And you need to give me all the keys you've made to my house. His expression changed again, from the pleased satisfaction of someone sharing good news to the frustrated confusion of someone whose logic wasn't being appreciated. Jordan, you're not thinking clearly. You're still in grief. You're not ready to make these kinds of decisions. The decision to have privacy in my own home? The decision to not be surveilled in my own bedroom? Those aren't grief decisions, David. Those are basic human rights. He started toward me, his hands raised in what was probably meant to be a calming gesture, but felt like a threat. You're overwrought. Let me help you. No. I stepped backward, but kept my voice steady. You've helped enough. Leave now, or I'm calling the police. And tell them what? That your friend has been taking care of you? That someone who loved Mark has been making sure you're safe. The casualness with which he dismissed my reality was almost as chilling as everything else. In David's world, my consent was irrelevant because he decided what was best for me. My comfort was unnecessary because he determined what I needed. My autonomy was inconvenient because it interfered with his plans. Breaking free from systematic control. What followed was the most difficult 3 weeks of my life, more difficult, in some ways, than the immediate aftermath of Mark's death. Because grief is an internal battle, but escaping from systematic manipulation is a war fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. I had to change all my locks again, this time using a locksmith David didn't know. I had to close and reopen bank accounts, cancel and replace credit cards, and undo financial connections I'd never fully understood I was making. I had to debug my car, my phone, my house, and even my computer, looking for tracking devices and surveillance software. Some I found, some I probably missed, but the process of looking gave me back a sense of agency I'd forgotten I was missing. I had to rebuild communication channels with family and friends, explaining why I'd been so isolated and unavailable without fully disclosing how comprehensive the manipulation had been. The shame of having been so thoroughly deceived was almost paralyzing. Most challenging of all, I had to learn to trust my own judgment again. David had spent weeks training me to doubt my instincts, to rely on his interpretations of my own needs and feelings. Reclaiming the right to make my own decisions, even wrong ones, was harder than I'd expected. When control becomes pursuit. David didn't accept his dismissal gracefully. The helpful facade dropped completely, replaced by a campaign of harassment that was somehow both terrifying and pathetic. The text messages continued, but now they were angry, accusatory, threatening. I was ungrateful, irrational, making a mistake I'd regret. He'd done everything for me, sacrificed his own comfort for my well-being, and this was how I repaid his devotion? He began showing up at places I frequented, the grocery store, the coffee shop, the grief counseling center. Not approaching me directly, but making sure I knew he was there, watching, waiting for me to come to my senses. The gifts continued too, but now they felt explicitly threatening. Photos of Mark and me from happier times, left on my doorstep with notes about how Mark would be disappointed in my choices. Items that could only have come from inside my house, proving that David had kept copies of keys I didn't know about. The police were sympathetic but limited in what they could do. David was careful not to explicitly threaten violence, and much of his behavior could be interpreted as the actions of a concerned friend being rejected by someone not thinking clearly due to grief. How predators use social networks. One of the most insidious aspects of David's campaign was how he managed to turn some of our mutual social connections against me. In his version of events, I was a grieving widow who'd become paranoid and unstable, rejecting help from people who cared about me. Several of Mark's work colleagues reached out to express concern about my isolation and to suggest that maybe I was being too hard on David, who was only trying to help. Some of our couple friends seemed to buy into the narrative that I was pushing away everyone who reminded me of Mark. David had spent months positioning himself as my primary caretaker and Mark's best friend. He'd documented his helpfulness, his sacrifice, his devotion. Now that documentation served as evidence for his version of reality, one in which I was the problem, not him. It was a masterclass in how predators use social proof to legitimize their behavior and discredit their victims. By the time I understood what was happening, David had already shaped the narrative in ways that made my accusations seem like the delusions of someone not handling grief well. When the system fails victims. Getting a restraining order against David should have been straightforward. I had evidence of surveillance, documentation of harassment, proof of financial manipulation. But the legal system is designed around clear-cut cases of physical violence or explicit threats, not the gray areas of psychological manipulation disguised as care. David's lawyer painted him as a devoted friend being persecuted by a mentally unstable widow. They presented his documentation of assistance as evidence of legitimate caregiving, his surveillance as security measures I'd consented to, his financial involvement as help I'd requested during a vulnerable time. The judge was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but struggled to find clear legal violations in behavior that could be interpreted as overly helpful rather than predatory. The restraining order I received was limited and temporary, requiring me to prove ongoing harassment rather than past manipulation. It was a sobering lesson in how the legal system can fail victims of sophisticated psychological predators, especially when those predators are careful to operate within technical boundaries of legal behavior while crossing every moral and ethical line imaginable. Rebuilding from systematic betrayal. Healing from David's manipulation was different from healing from Mark's death, though the two processes became intertwined in complicated ways. Grief is painful but natural. Manipulation recovery involves untangling lies from reality, questioning every memory, and rebuilding basic trust in your own perceptions. I had to relearn how to make decisions without second-guessing whether David had influenced the information I was basing them on. I had to rebuild relationships with people who'd been isolated from me or turned against me. I had to process the violation of privacy that extended far beyond the bedroom camera to encompass nearly every aspect of my life. Most difficult was coming to terms with how the manipulation had interacted with my grief. David hadn't just taken advantage of my vulnerability, he'd actively interfered with my healing process, redirecting my emotional energy toward dependence on him rather than recovery and growth. The grief counselor I eventually found, after ensuring David had no connection to the practice, helped me understand that this was a common pattern. Predators often target people during major life transitions, death, divorce, job loss, illness, because these situations create natural vulnerability and social disruption that makes manipulation easier to conceal. Understanding the long game. As I gained distance from the situation, I began to understand just how long David's campaign had actually been running. The friendship with Mark hadn't been genuine, it had been reconnaissance. David had spent 12 years studying our relationship, our patterns, our vulnerabilities, positioning himself for an opportunity that he may have been hoping would eventually arise. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunistic predation. It was systematic, patient, and strategic. David had invested years in building trust and access, creating a foundation that would allow him to move quickly and comprehensively when the chance presented itself. The most chilling realization was that David had probably been hoping for Mark's death, or at least preparing for it, long before it happened. The efficiency with which he'd assumed control wasn't just helpfulness, it was the execution of a plan that had been years in the making. What I wish I'd known. Looking back, I can now identify red flags that were invisible to me at the time, but might help other people recognize similar patterns. Excessive helpfulness that creates dependency rather than empowerment. Offers to handle tasks that maintain control rather than teaching independence. Someone who becomes indispensable by design rather than by natural evolution of a relationship. Information gathering disguised as caring concern. Questions about routines, schedules, financial situations, social connections that go beyond normal friendship boundaries. Someone who remembers details about your life better than you do, especially details you don't remember sharing. Isolation techniques presented as protection. Discouraging contact with family and friends, screening communications, creating reasons why outside support would be harmful or inappropriate. Someone who positions themselves as your primary resource for everything. Boundary violations justified by crisis or care. Someone who doesn't respect no as an answer, who finds ways around boundaries you try to set, who uses your vulnerable state as justification for inappropriate access or control. Documentation and legitimization of control. Someone who insists on being present for important conversations, who handles paperwork you're capable of managing yourself, who creates official-looking evidence of their authority in your life. How society enables this predation. David's manipulation worked so well partly because it exploited societal expectations about grief, gender, and helpfulness. We expect widows to be vulnerable and grateful for assistance. We praise men who step up to help during crisis. We interpret controlling behavior as care when it's directed at someone we perceive as needing protection. These social scripts provided perfect cover for David's predation. His behavior looked like exactly what we expect to see from a good friend helping a grieving widow. The fact that it was actually systematic manipulation designed to transfer control of my life to him was invisible to most observers because it matched their expectations so perfectly. This is how sophisticated predators operate, not by violating social norms, but by weaponizing them. They understand what behavior will be interpreted as admirable and use that understanding to camouflage their true intentions. Long-term effects of systematic manipulation. The effects of David's manipulation extended far beyond the immediate crisis of escaping his control. I had to rebuild my ability to trust other people's motives, to accept help without paranoia, to maintain relationships without fear that kindness was actually manipulation in disguise. I had to learn to trust my own judgment again, to believe that my discomfort with someone's behavior was valid even when that behavior could be interpreted as helpful or caring. I had to recalibrate my understanding of normal friendship boundaries versus predatory intrusion. The intersection with my grief complicated everything. I couldn't just process Mark's death, I had to process how David had contaminated that grief, used it as a weapon, and interfered with my natural healing process. Some of my memories of the immediate aftermath of Mark's death were now tainted by the understanding of what had really been happening. What saved me? Several factors were crucial in my eventual escape from David's manipulation. First was the camera discovery, a violation so clear and undeniable that it cut through the fog of gaslighting and forced me to see the situation clearly. Second was maintaining some connection to my own intuition. Throughout David's campaign, I'd felt uncomfortable, trapped, violated, feelings I'd dismissed as grief symptoms but which were actually accurate assessments of my situation. Third was having eventually found a grief counselor who wasn't connected to David's network, someone who could provide perspective on my experiences without David's influence. Most importantly was my decision to act on my understanding even when I couldn't prove it to others. I didn't wait for legal validation or social support to change my locks, close accounts, and rebuild my boundaries. I trusted my own assessment of the situation and acted to protect myself even when others thought I was overreacting. Life after predation. David eventually moved away, whether because his harassment campaign wasn't working or because he'd found another target, I don't know. The legal harassment continued for several months through his lawyer, but eventually that stopped too. I kept the house, rebuilt my social connections, and eventually learned to accept help from others without constant suspicion. I remarried a few years later, someone David had never met, from a completely different social circle, who understands why I need transparency and respect for boundaries in ways that might seem excessive to others. I still have moments of hypervigilance, especially when someone offers help that seems too comprehensive or too eager. I still double-check my smoke detectors regularly. I still maintain financial and digital security practices that probably seem paranoid to people who haven't experienced systematic manipulation. But I also have a deeper understanding of my own strength, my own judgment, and my own worth. I survived not just Mark's death, but also a predator who tried to use that death to claim ownership of my life. I reclaimed my autonomy from someone who'd systematically dismantled it, and I rebuilt my life on terms that were entirely my own. Trust your instincts. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: your discomfort with someone's behavior is information, not illness. If someone's helpfulness feels controlling, if their care feels invasive, if their concern feels like surveillance, trust those feelings, even when you can't articulate why. Predators count on our politeness, our gratitude, our tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt. They use our vulnerability as a weapon and our social conditioning as camouflage. The only defense is trusting yourself enough to set boundaries, even when those boundaries seem ungrateful or paranoid to others. Grief is hard enough without becoming prey to someone who sees your pain as opportunity. Mark's death was a tragedy, but it didn't have to become David's hunting ground. The difference was my eventual decision to trust my own instincts over everyone else's interpretations of the situation. Your life belongs to you, even when you're too broken to fight for it. Sometimes survival means being willing to seem ungrateful, unreasonable, or unstable in order to protect yourself from people whose helpfulness is actually harm in disguise. That's a lesson I learned at great cost, but one I hope you'll never need to use.